Rising. My name is Marisol Descalzo, and I, along with Vanessa Johannes, founded and host the podcast Athena Rising so that lawyers can tell their stories. In season 1, we featured powerhouse women and their powerful stories. In season 2, we feature men who are allies to these powerful women. Today is a national legend and community leader, Jon Sale. Not only is Jon known as an eminent white-collar criminal defense attorney, Jon is extremely dedicated to the legal community in the Southern District of Florida. He serves on multiple committees that have a hand in selecting federal court judges and magistrate judges. Chambers refers to Jon as the grandfather of the criminal defense bar. He is often asked to appear on national TV as a legal analyst on cable shows, including CNN, Fox News, and NPR. Without further ado, welcome Jon Sale to Athena Rising.
Thanks, Marisol.
Thank you. So Jon, thanks for joining us today, and it's really an honor to have you. You really are a legend, and I'm really excited to do this interview. I want to start by asking you, what led you to become a lawyer?
I gave very little thought to becoming a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. His brother was a lawyer. My older brother was a lawyer. And I gave absolutely no thought to it. I just thought it was something I was always going to do. And I started law school. I graduated from a very competitive college in 3 years. I don't know why I don't know why I rushed. Best years of my life. And I started law school. And after 2 weeks, I dropped out. I dropped out because I didn't know why I was there. And I went to work for a year. And then I went back because I wanted to be back. And so that's why I went to law school.
Interesting. So I've never heard that story. So when you dropped out of law school, what did you work?
I just went to work for a company as if I had a business degree. I took a leave of absence, so I had a year to go back. But nowadays, this gap year is very common. People, medical school, law school, they take a year or two in between graduate school and law school.
Yeah, especially because you were only 21 probably when you started law school, 20 or 21 years old.
Just barely, yeah.
Yeah, just there. And so after law school, at some point you become a prosecutor. Was that right after law school or a couple of years later?
I clerked for, everybody's loyal to their clerk, to their judge. I clerked for one of the greatest human beings. It's kind of you to say I'm a legend, which of course I'm not, but he is a legend in the Southern District of New York. And he was an extraordinary judge. I was so fortunate to get the job. And it's in a lot of people's careers, your first job leads to your second, and each one opens up another door. And so I had a wonderful year clerking for a judge who, besides being a great judge, was a great human being. And he was what today they might call progressive or activist. And towards the end of his life, when the pendulum was switching the other way, I remember saying to him, "Judge, are you discouraged? You're seeing your life's work going the other direction." And he was always the eternal optimist. And he said, "Life swings in pendulums and it goes in cycles. Don't be discouraged." So I've always taken that lesson.
That's good advice.
He would not, when he became senior, he disliked the guidelines so much that he would stop taking criminal cases.
Oh, wow. That's right, because the guidelines were mandatory.
They're starting in 1987.
Okay. Incredible. And so he led you to the U.S. Attorney's Office following your clerkship?
He was a judge who the government hated to get, yet more of his clerks went to the U.S. Attorney's Office than any other judge on the bench. I didn't know what the U.S. Attorney's Office was. Never heard of it. I heard of the district attorney from television. But when I got a federal clerkship, every day, and he encouraged the clerks to sit in court, and every day I saw the U.S. attorney. And I don't want to sound like a snob, but it was in the Southern District. You notice I don't say the Southern District of New York, the Southern District. And that job I really aspired to. And I was offered by several other so-called institutional big law firms. And each one of the offers, they said, "Hey, we know you have an application to the Southern District. If you get it, go. And go for 3 or 4 years, and you're welcome back with like 3 or 4 years credit." So going to that job, no one was more surprised than me to get it, but that was what I did.
And how long did you stay in government?
I stayed in government for about 10 years. I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Connecticut, and I became what they called the managing assistant. And a lot of people wonder why I did that. I don't know myself, but that's when Watergate came along, and that was they were different times, but that was an extraordinary opportunity. And I worked with some of the most wonderful people. I did not work on the Hill. I worked in the Watergate Special Prosecutor's office. And our youngest lawyers, who basically did most of our research, were 6 lawyers right from Supreme Court clerkships. And the talent in that office was just unbelievable. And I guess the most memorable part of that experience, it's hard to pick one, but was the Saturday Night Massacre, where, to make a long story short, where the President of the United States did something that Donald Trump hasn't done. He refused to follow a court order. And that was genuinely a constitutional crisis. We use that term too often, but he refused to follow a court order, and he directed us. We weren't allowed to go to court. Continue the investigation, but you're not allowed to go to court. And the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, who was one of the most wonderful people you'd ever want to know, he didn't care about the job. He said, hey, this job isn't about me. And he talked about Andrew Jackson. And when he said he threatened the court, and he said, hey, it's John Marshall's order, let him go and enforce it, meaning the court doesn't have an army. It's just the respect for the court. But the Saturday Night Massacre, he fired the Attorney General, he fired the Deputy Attorney General. They sent armed FBI agents to occupy the office of the Attorney General of the United States. They fired my whole office, and there was a 3-day holiday. And unlike today, when everyone is so polarized, there was such a outrage expressed by the people that they just had to back down. But those were 3 scary days in between that Saturday night and Tuesday when we all went to court.
And I want to back it up for the listeners that don't know. So, you've been involved in some very famous cases and investigations. One of them is in the Watergate investigation, and you were assigned to what's called a special prosecution team. Is that right?
Right.
And so let's talk about, because I have some questions about the Saturday Night Massacre. My understanding is that Nixon called the prosecutors on the phone at home and told them.
No.
Now, is that not true?
No, what actually happened is there's not enough time to go through all the events, but there was a subpoena for tapes.
Okay.
And we prevailed. The judge was a very famous Judge Jon Sale. We prevailed. The White House appealed. We won again. Then they had a certain number of days to go to the Supreme Court. And when they didn't go to the Supreme Court, it was obvious that something was going to happen. But he summoned the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and he directed him to fire us. And Elliot Richardson said, I won't do it. And Elliot Richardson later wrote that he was offered all sorts of positions or perks if he would do it. He wouldn't do it. The Deputy Attorney General wouldn't do it. They both resigned. Finally, the Solicitor General was not going to do it. But Elliot Richardson said, look, save the institution. If everybody starts resigning, the institution would survive. So the Solicitor General, who was Robert Bork, who later paid the price because he was not confirmed to the Supreme Court. And that was the beginning of acrimonious Supreme Court confirmations. So everybody was fired. And 3 days later, we were reinstated by a provision in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. So I've often, I'm teasing, but I've often thought on a job application, have you ever been fired or asked to resign? How do I answer that? Yes, but footnote, I was proud to be.
Wow. So what's going through your mind that weekend from Saturday to Tuesday? Is everyone calling each other and figuring out, do we show up on Tuesday? Do we not?
We all went down to the office. It was confusion. One of my colleagues, who was one of our press officers, so the agents there who were occupying our office, they didn't want to be there. They didn't want to do it, but they were ordered to do it. And one of my colleagues, and he wrote about this, he went into his office and then he walked out with something under his arm. And the agent said, Jim, I'm sorry, you can't take that out. And my colleague said, it's a copy of the Constitution, just stamp it void. and we laugh about it now, and the agent said, Jim, I'm sorry, I'm just doing what I'm told. But it was utter chaos and confusion. But nobody thought about their jobs. I mean, maybe it was just, we were all young. The older people were gonna leave. They were there, they went back to their law firms, but we just thought, we didn't know what each day was gonna hold. And then today, with cable television and with lobbyists, everything is orchestrated, no matter which side you're on of an issue. It wasn't orchestrated. I mean, an incredible number of messages came into the Congress, to the White House, every organization. Here in Miami, Chesterfield Smith, who was the great lawyer from Holland and Knight, was the president of the ABA. And he was one of many, many organizations who issued the statement the first time you started hearing no one's above the law. That's the first time you heard it. Now we're hearing it a lot too.
A lot more now.
And it turned out nobody was above the law, or so we thought.
Incredible. And so when you're occupying the office because the agents don't want you there, I'm assuming it was utter chaos between deciding who's staying, who's going.
Everybody was urged to wait and see and not to pack up and just to stay in order for the cause. I didn't have any inside information, but the investigation I was working on, I just so happened to have a cooperating witness. And on Friday, we had a meeting for after the weekend. We took a suite in a hotel because we knew something was going to happen, but we really didn't know what. And that's when the roof caved in.
And now your cooperating witness was related to the Watergate?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had someone cooperating on Watergate. Oh, that's incredible. And now you mentioned that the order that came down that caused the Saturday massacre was because of the recordings. Now, those were secret recordings that Nixon had made in his office, in his Oval Office. But
we only asked for 9 of them. We asked for 9. They were secret recordings. We asked for, so someone named Alexander Butterfield, it almost came out inadvertently. He was not a significant player, but when he was asked in the Watergate congressional hearings, were there any recording devices in the Oval Office or in the Executive Office building? He said yes, and everybody was stunned. And once there were recording devices, John Dean, who's still around, John Dean, who still you see on television from time to time, it was his word against Nixon. That you couldn't make a criminal case based upon one person's word. He happened to be White House counsel against the president of the United States. We learned there were recordings. The recordings could corroborate Dean's testimony, but they could also just as easily exonerate him. And the White House didn't believe that. But we weren't out to get Nixon. We were out to just uncover the facts. And if I can tell you, if the recordings showed Dean wasn't telling the truth, we would have done our job just as thoroughly.
And I guess that's the mandate when they form these special prosecution teams. It's just like figure out what happened.
Well, it should be.
Well, it should be.
Yeah.
It should be. But that was your mandate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. It was like figure out what happened. We're not blaming anyone yet until we see what.
Well, it all started when one of the original. It all came from a burglary, a third-rate burglary in the Democratic National Headquarters. Watergate is a building. It's still there. And the burglars were tried and convicted. And at sentencing, one of them wrote a letter to the judge and said, the White House is behind all of this. That's what opened the whole thing up for a third-rate burglary to not just covering up Watergate, but the enemies list, breaking into a psychiatrist's office. I mean, countless things like that.
And how long did you work on this investigation?
Well, I worked for about 2 years on this as part of the staff. And then the Attorney General asked me to become a special assistant to him to do one investigation. So I did that for about 6 months. And then that.
Also related to Watergate?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, so
it was because I got to know the Attorney General, the new Attorney General, and he asked me to do an investigation, which I wrote about 6 months, and I wrote a 75-page, 100-page process memo before there were laptops recommending we not prosecute. And they accepted it involved bribery in connection with getting an ambassadorship.
Oh, fascinating. So that was also, I'm sure, very interesting for you to work on.
But the most interesting thing for cocktail party talk about Watergate is that I, together with many of my colleagues, must have spent 100 hours listening to tapes, White House tapes, and most of them are not yet released. Most of them are still classified, but they will be released. And that was fascinating.
I've heard there's 3,000 that he recorded almost 3,000 hours.
Yeah.
And I was reading the National Archives preparing for this interview, and some of the things he says, he's just, like people come into his office, and as soon as they walk out, he starts. Yeah. So that must have been fascinating at the time.
But it's not like you're going to the Metropolitan Opera. I mean, they were very hard to hear, and you had to have earphones and listen very carefully.
Okay.
It's like sometimes at a criminal case, when they just give us tapes and we have to make transcripts, it's very difficult.
Right. And you can't talk to anybody about it at the time, and
Yeah,
all this time,
that's right,
other than each other.
that's right. There were two different times in my life as a prosecutor when I was involved in very sensitive investigations. And there was a leak, 2 times where there was a leak.
Oh, wow.
So at both times, the court ordered an investigation. And so everybody involved, agent or AUSA, was required to submit an affidavit which said, list every person you spoke to about this matter. And the interesting thing, I've thought about this many times, was, so I might write, I spoke to AUSA A, B, C, and D, and these 2 agents. And that's fine. But the real question would be, if you were doing something that really was high visibility, how many people spoke to their wives or their husbands or their significant others, and how many of those who did put it down?
So true.
Yeah.
So true, because it's hard to keep some of that stuff.
Oh, I know, over the dinner table.
Yeah, over the dinner table, of course. What did you do today? I listened to,
That's
10
right.
hours of
Right.
of Nixon babbling. So let's switch gears a little bit, because we could stay on Watergate forever, but you also were part of another very famous and important case, which is the United States versus Fedorenko. And this was actually an attempt by the US government to denaturalize a Ukrainian citizen that worked at a Nazi
An
death
American
camp.
citizen.
He was an American citizen from Ukraine originally, that worked at a Nazi death camp.
Right.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
And how did you become involved in that case?
It was a case, one of the most famous Nazi hunters, Simon Wiesenthal, he and his people found him. And it involved Treblinka, which was a death camp. It was not, I mean, even Auschwitz, part of it was a work camp. At Treblinka, everybody was killed quickly. They had to do it. They killed 900,000 people in a year. And some people, when they'd be brought off the freight trains, they'd be packed in, they'd be marched to the gas chambers, not really marched, dragged. Some people would pull out a line to do work, but the plan would be in about 60 or 90 days, they'd be killed. But there was an uprising, and about 100 people escaped, about 50 of them made it, about 25 of them made it to Palestine, Israel, and they were people who observed the atrocities, which are unspeakable. But it was not a crime in the United States then. It would be now, actually, but it wouldn't. So all we could do would be, he had become an American citizen. He lied about what he did during the war, and he lied about his background. And he lived a quiet life, under the radar. And all we could do would be take away his citizenship. And that was a non-jury civil bench trial. But the people who were my witnesses came from Israel. The investigation was done by the Israeli police, and they came and they were the witnesses, and they had to relive the unbelievable horrors of being what it was like to being in Treblinka, which puts everything we do, prosecutor, defense lawyer, police officer, in proportion. Every other crime, even Ted Bundy, everything is de minimis compared to the Nazi death camps.
Right. Well, from my reading, I understand that millions were killed at this camp.
In a year, 900,000 people
in 1 year. In 1 year. And so you said something about, because that was one of my questions, how does the US discover that Fedorenko's living in the US and has become a citizen? So it's a Nazi hunter?
Well, Simon Wiesenthal, the Wiesenthal Museum is still very well known. They made it their life's mission to track down Nazi war criminals.
Mhm.
Now they're probably not alive anymore, but this was, I don't recall the year, in the 80s.
It was in the 80s.
And he was an old man then.
Right. He was very old. He was retired, and he had been living in the US for 25 years.
He worked quietly because he didn't want to be discovered in Connecticut. And of all places, he retired to Miami Beach, surrounded by Jewish people.
I read that, and I found it interesting. Is that why the case was in Southern District of Florida?
Because they found him here.
Okay. And by this time, you've made your way to the Southern District of Florida, and you're working at the US
I was
Attorney's
the chief assistant, or the first assistant. But the way I got involved in the case was, it was getting a lot of national notoriety. So my boss, the US attorney, thought it would be appropriate if I handled it, but it was a whole team, so I was the lead prosecutor.
So that's why you were doing, and so instead of having because usually a case like that would be handled, I guess, by the civil.
Not this one, there was I think it still exists, something in DOJ called the Special Prosecutions Unit. And they came down with the case, but many US attorneys, certainly in the Southern District of New York, think that if there's a major case in their district, that an AUSA should be the lead, no matter what DOJ says. But that's cultural, different districts, that's different.
Understand. So now I understand. So it was the Department of Justice and then you as the lead prosecutor as the one.
They brought the case.
Okay.
And then it was in this district, so the US attorney said, I want to take the lead, particularly, this is such an important case. Right. So he just came into my office one day and said, "Do you read about this case?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, it's yours now."
Wow. Were you happy about the assignment, or were you worried that it was going to be too controversial?
I was neither, because I didn't know that much about the Holocaust. And it just seemed like, it's more, the boss asked me to do something. And it took me a while to learn about it.
And how did you communicate with, did the Israeli police that investigated the case, did they speak English, or did you have translators?
We had translators, but they all spoke English, people who came over. I got a call before they came from a doctor who I didn't know. And he said, "I'm an Auschwitz survivor. I practice in Hollywood. And I've organized a group of doctors who are going to be available, and I'm going to give you their beeper numbers." And I said to him, "That's very nice of you, but I don't understand." He said, "When you spend hours and hours talking to these people, you're going to need it." And sure enough, one of the gentlemen, as he was recounting how he had his 2-year-old child under his jacket, and when he got off the train, one of the Nazis heard the child, grabbed him and held up the child and blew his brains out right in front of the father. And the father, when he was telling this story to me, he collapsed. And his wife, he moved to Israel, a new family. His wife caught him. And I didn't know, I'm not a doctor. I was very frightened.
Of course.
And in 10 minutes, the doctor was there. And he said he was in shock, but he'd be fine. So wow, it was an experience like no other.
I'm sure it was. Did you go to Israel to interview people?
No.
They would come here. They would all come. I'm sure that all these witnesses wanted to come and kind of have their moment.
They felt they were obligated, but many of them had never even shared with their families what they went through. And so no, they didn't want to come, but they felt it was their duty to come. And when I said to them, most of them, if not all, had never been to the US. So I told them, when you're done with this, you ought to take a few days and maybe go this place or that place. They all said, because of the reason they came, what they went through, they want to just go home as quickly as possible. Wow.
You mentioned that Fedorenko was actually living in Connecticut most of the time when he moved to the US, and then he retired to Miami Beach. Fedorenko's lawyers actually tried to move the venue of the trial to Connecticut, right, and the government opposed that. Why did you? It didn't matter. It was a non-jury trial. Okay. So it didn't really matter. So that was the government's position, that it didn't matter. Well, I can't imagine. I don't even remember why it mattered, because it wasn't going to change the judge. It was a bench trial. Right. So the judge would have gone. That particular judge loved to travel, so he would have gone anyway. Oh, did he? In fact, he did have a couple of hearings in Connecticut. Did he? Yeah. Interesting. Now, I've also read that every day during the trial, there were protesters outside chanting and yelling, that you could hear it in the courtroom. There was a lot of emotion. Yeah. And the judge put some people in jail for contempt for being too loud outside, I read. He threatened. He never put anybody in jail. And the trial was actually in Fort Lauderdale, right, not Miami. Correct. And why did they do it in Fort Lauderdale? Because it was assigned to a particular judge in the wheel. And he was up there. Okay. And it was before the Fort Lauderdale courthouse was built. It was, the old court, before the one that now is dilapidated. It was before that one. Okay. Now, in my readings, I've read that the judge, he was very vocal during the trial about how much money the government was spending on the case. He talked about the cost of daily transcripts. He talked about flying witnesses all over the world. He said that this was unheard of. How did the government feel being, on that end of, a judge being unhappy with them? It's usually the defense that feels that way. All of those resources today are common, but in the 1980s, it was, in fairness, it was uncommon.
but it really raises a larger question, and that 30 years had gone by since he was an officer at Treblinka. And there were a sizable number of people in the community who felt, look, he was an old man. He lived a good life in the United States. 30 years, you don't devote a lot of resources. You've got problems today. There were other people in the community, and the DOJ's position was there are some crimes you never forget. And if you go to some of the remnants of these camps, I just gave a talk about a week ago with Judge Roy Altman. We did it together to a very large group, and I forgot I sort of slide of one of the camps. We'll never forget. But that, people differ on that. Do you forgive after all those years? I never thought you did, not these kind of crimes, but that was the sentiment. And that judge wrote in his opinion, he's a court of equity, and he weighed very carefully the good life, and he ruled against us, basically saying that after all these years, he led a good life as a court of equity. Citizenship is very valuable. I'm not going to take away citizenship. It was quickly reversed by the Court of Appeals, and the Attorney General of the United States said, I want to personally argue this case when the Supreme Court took it. It's very unusual. The AG personally argues the case. And of course they affirmed, but something about justice. It took 30 some odd years to find him. After we won the case in the Supreme Court, it then went to the Immigration Service, and he was then deported. And he was deported to the old Soviet Union. He also had committed war crimes in the Ukraine. So roughly it was 35 years for us. Within 18 months, he was trial, appeal, he was executed.
In Ukraine?
No, in the old Soviet
Oh, in the
Union
old
under
Soviet
Brezhnev.
Union.
So
Wow.
they had a very different system of justice. I'm not saying that was right, but
Right.
I'm saying that it's quite a contrast.
Incredible. And I think some of the things that I've read that the trial judge said was that Fedorenko, and tell me if this is wrong, that Fedorenko himself, I felt almost like he was making him a victim. He was kind of saying he didn't want to be there. He wasn't German. They made him.
Well, it was a law 30 some odd years ago. And there was another very well-known case where it turned out they got the wrong guy. I didn't have that issue. Fedorenko stipulated they got the right guy. His defense was he was following orders. His defense was, if I didn't do these things, I'd have been killed. But our position was the evidence didn't support that. Our evidence, we had a lot of evidence that he, for example, would leave. He carried a gun. Whatever officers carry. He was allowed to leave. He was allowed to go to town. So there was a lot of other evidence, I don't recall off the top of my head, where we contended that he was not just following orders, he had a lot of choices too.
I did read that he was permitted to go into town where many of these officers were not. Or not, I don't know if you call him an officer, but I think they would call him. I guess he's not an officer. He was. They had some other title.
He had insignias on,
right,
and was able to give instructions to others. So.
Right, he gave instructions to others. He had a gun. He was able to go into town.
But the case turned on really in the appellate court whether his false statement was material. That's what it turned on, and both the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court said, just as a matter of law, by denying he was a guard at Treblinka, it's a matter of law. He's ineligible to enter the United States. Mm-hmm. So it was material, as we lawyers say. Right.
I mean, it seems like a straight legal argument. It's weird that there was even this big trial and all of this stuff. They could have probably.
Well, we had to prove. No,
we had to prove that he was the guard. I guess.
We had to prove. He said, "I was a forced laborer in Berlin. That's how I came into the country." We had to prove that he was not.
Okay.
So, and we had to prove what he did, and therefore he was not what he claimed to be. That's why it was not just a straight legal question.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you had the whole trial. Fascinating. And at the time, the Department of Justice felt that this was a very important issue in the 80s for them.
The Department of Justice, through all administrations, have thought that real war criminals need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
It's fascinating. I want to switch gears again. I want to talk about your work in the South Florida legal community. You are referred to as the grandfather of the criminal defense bar.
I really have to take issue with that.
Really?
Because it's a funny story, but our mutual good friend, David Marcus.
Yes.
did not say that. He was misquoted.
Really?
Yeah. David said, being teasing, but he spoke to Chambers and he said that I'm the godfather.
Oh, the godfather.
And I really got annoyed at him. And I said, he really owes me. So it really was so I'm disputed that the grandfather. And in Chambers, which a lot of general counsels look at that. I mean, most of these things you see on the wall are, these plaque selling things. But so I told David that there's another category in Chambers and it's called senior lawyers. And I'm not going to mention names, but some people you and I know are in that. That's the last place I want to be. I don't want to be in that category. So I'm.
You want to be like the uncle, the godfather.
And David made a godfather. And to another group, David said that I'm like Obi Ben Kenobi. And I'm not even a Star Wars fan, so I don't relate to that. But so I sort of, with David, I tell him he really owes me for that mistake.
He does owe you because it's all over the internet.
I know,
that's where I got it. It's so how do you use your influence? I know some of the good things that you do for the community, but tell us some of the, tell my listeners some of the things you do for the legal community.
I don't know if it's for the legal community, but I'll tell you, but one of the things I think about some real pro bono work is not to talk about it, because then everybody thinks you have an agenda. But for 6 or 7 years, I devoted myself one entire day a week to working with, we call it NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, on a very high level. This is started by John Walsh in his garage years ago when he lost his son. And that has been, not through money. I mean, I'm not in a position to give millions of dollars, but that's been something that I've done, and I've brought other people into it. And even as recently as the past year, they do the most extraordinary things, and they partner with law enforcement. Anytime a child goes missing, that's the first person in the line of defense. They have a hotline, they get thousands of calls a day, but they have a branch office in our district, and nobody knows about it. So I called our new U.S. attorney and I said, do you know that NCMEC has a branch office in your district? He said, no. He said, I know what great work they do. And I said, well, they do. And maybe respectfully, you're the U.S. attorney, maybe you want to go up there and meet the people. So I arranged it and I took him up there, and anyone who does go there would be just, in great awe of what great work they do.
I never in a million years expected you to say that, John. I really had no idea about your involvement in that. Yeah, I had no idea about your involvement. That's extremely commendable, and I'm sure. And even though you don't give money, giving your time is very, very valuable and harder to do.
I might give $100, but
yeah, but of course. Well, I also know that you do things such as you mentioned the U.S. attorney. In Southern District of Florida, you're also trying to bring the defense bar and the U.S. attorney's office together to kind of work together better.
Yeah, that's a challenge, as you know as well as I do.
It is. So you want to tell us a little bit about that initiative and why you're trying to do that?
I think there's too much of us against them. And, we all are trying to do the same thing. We fight hard in court, but so I just think that if we can talk about things together and reason together and make the system better, and it's an uphill battle, but we're trying. We tried it in Miami and we made a little bit of progress. So we've expanded it. I was just on a call today to the Northern Division, where they have same district, just 20 miles away to go to Fort Lauderdale, but they have some different issues. Like I just learned today, I don't know if you know this or not, that here you communicate with, if a client's in jail, you can communicate electronically. Well, they can't do that in the Broward County Jail. And some of the public defenders today were telling me how frustrating that is. Those are the type of things we're trying to change.
And
they don't affect my practice.
Right.
But that's why I think it's important that we get all out of our own little lane and try and work together as a profession.
The reality is that a lot of the issues, because you asked me to be part of that committee for Miami, and a lot of the issues don't affect our practice, right? But they do affect, those that are not as fortunate as to hire a lawyer like Jon Sale, and it's important. What do you think the disconnect is between the defense bar and, I mean, I think that the defense bar and the prosecutors really work very well together in our district, much better, I find, than sometimes civil litigators. But there is a disconnect. What do you think that is? Is it just competing interest, or is it the bureaucracy at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
In this district, I think that the office is so large, and that it's just, some things are frustrating. I just think we have to change the culture. And I think everybody agrees with that. But then it becomes a matter of what is the culture? It used to be, and there's no right or wrong here, but it used to be that sentencing, usually prosecutors, except in most extraordinary cases, thought that was mainly for the court. They tried hard to win their cases. They won most of them then, as they do now. And then they thought, they would speak up, but sentencing, now we litigate sentencing, probably more than we do anything else, more than we do, because most cases, unfortunately, cases are pleas, unfortunately. But I think that it's just, sometimes it's nasty and it shouldn't be.
It is. It's unnecessary. I agree. Jon, you, like I said, you're really a leader in the community, and I'm a woman, your wife is a woman, and obviously, and she's a lawyer. And, you have helped a lot of women get to very important positions. Do you feel that today women and men are on equal footing in the legal community?
Yes, my wife and I have different skill sets. We're law partners, but we have very different skill sets. 20 years ago, I'm making up that figure. If I thought I had a client, but I thought that my wife Jane her skill set would be much better, I would actually, for the most time, I would have to apologize. I would say, I really want you to meet my wife. She's a woman, but give her a chance. Now, all things being equal, if we meet with a new client, more often than not, they'd rather have her.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And look around the law schools. I mean, the law schools are 50%, give or take, men and women. When I went to law school, in a section of 100, there were 3 women.
Wow, definitely times have definitely changed. But do you think that there's still some work to do to get women, because there's a lot of talk about how women are not making as much money as men at law firms, and they're not making partner as quickly. Do you think that that is really?
I think that's changing.
You think it's changing?
I think it is.
I want to, soften up my questions a little bit and do my fun. There's always some fun questions on our podcast. So, there's a lot of studies done about top execs and leaders like yourself that they have a very specific morning routine. That's the key to their success. Do you have a morning routine that you follow?
Morning routine is we argue about who's going to walk the dog, and then I try to take a jog and a swim. But I'll do anything to avoid the traffic. There's nothing I hate more than the traffic. So I like to, if I don't have an appointment or be in court, I like to go after the traffic.
Okay. Do you have any superstitions when you're in trial?
I don't think I have any superstitions. I wish it were not such an uneven playing field.
I think we all wish that, at least on the defense side.
but that's an unrealistic wish. I mean, I should say.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I ever received is something that I gave to my youngest son recently, is to look back at some of the mistakes you made and try and do something nice or good for people when you're not getting something in return. And our youngest son did something like that just the other day, which it even brings tears to my eyes to say it. He works for a hedge fund in New York. He's got a great life. His girlfriend has just finished her 3rd year of veterinary school. I mean, they're a high-powered couple. He said, Dad, there was an old man in the elevator in my building, and every day I see he lives alone. And I think I'm going to knock on his door and ask him if he would like me to take him to the park for a walk. That's just out of the blue. And I said to him, that's so wonderful. I said, but he must have had a family at one time. He must have worked at some time, a life. Talk to him about that. And he called me back later and he said, it was just terrific. He said, but I couldn't stop him talking. After an hour or so, I had to take him back. Of
course, because he's lonely. Wow. You did a good job raising your son, obviously. What do you think has been your biggest failure, and what did you learn from it?
And I give people, softball question in an interview and somebody says, what's your biggest fault? Yeah, I've interviewed a lot of people and I've been interviewed, and there are some stock answers for that. But I probably have had a lot of failures, so nothing particular comes to my mind. I mean, some people say, "What's your biggest fault?" Oh, I'm just too kind, or I'm too good a person. I've had a lot of failures, and it balances out in life.
Yeah, I think we all have when you're on the defense side, right? Yeah. Those are sometimes hard to swallow. What is the biggest takeaway you hope to give listeners today, or any advice you have for the listeners?
Everybody should find their own path and not be worried about what other people are going to think. I've gone through with two boys the college admissions process, how hard and competitive it is. What I've told other people is, with a kid go to college, it should be where they fit, not to give parents bragging rights the way they go to school. Just do what you think is right, because that's what you take with you. When I was first sworn in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, my boss was Bob Morgenthau, who was the district attorney in New York until he was in his 90s, literally. And he had a very close relationship with the Kennedy family. And he said, when I was sworn in, he used to gather the whole office at 8:30 in the morning, and it would be a 5-minute ceremony. That would be all. And he said, when I, Bob Morgenthau, was asked to take this job by Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, he said, Bob, there are 2 rules in this for the Southern District. 1, always do what's right. And 2, there are no other rules. That I always take that with me.
That's
although most of us can't get away with that.
But that's very good advice. Well, thank you very much, Jon, for taking the time to speak to me. It was great to have you.